There's a maneuver that has a name specifically designed to warn pilots away from attempting it: the impossible turn. It's the decision, after losing an engine or experiencing total power loss shortly after takeoff, to turn around 180 degrees and attempt to land back on the runway you just departed from. For decades, flight instructors have taught students to avoid this maneuver. Accident databases are filled with crashed aircraft whose pilots attempted it and failed. Safety seminars dedicate entire presentations to explaining why it's so dangerous. And yet, pilots continue to attempt it, continue to die attempting it, because the instinct to turn back to the familiar safety of the airport is so powerful that it overrides training, overrides knowledge, overrides rational decision-making. But what makes the impossible turn particularly deadly in Citation jets, aircraft that are specifically designed and certificated to fly on one engine? Why did this maneuver, attempted in a capable aircraft by an experienced pilot, kill Greg Biffle, Dennis Dutton, and Jack Dutton? Today we're going to examine the specific aerodynamic and performance characteristics of Citation jets that make the impossible turn even more dangerous than in other aircraft types, why the margins are so thin that even small errors become fatal, and why the Citation pilot community needs to understand this danger before the next crew attempts the same maneuver with the same tragic results. Let's start by understanding what the impossible turn actually is and why it exists as a concept in aviation training. The scenario is this: you take off, you're climbing away from the airport, you're low, typically somewhere between 500 and 2,000 feet above the ground, and you experience engine failure or total power loss. Your immediate instinct is to turn around 180 degrees and land back on the runway you just departed from. It's right there behind you. You can probably still see it. You know where it is, you know the runway length, the approaches, the layout. It's familiar, and it represents safety. The problem is that turning around and getting back to that runway from low altitude requires a very specific set of conditions and near-perfect execution. And if any of those conditions aren't met, or if you make even small errors in execution, you're going to crash. The term impossible turn is somewhat misleading because the turn isn't literally impossible under all circumstances in all aircraft. But it's called impossible because for most pilots in most aircraft under most conditions, shortly after takeoff, attempting it is fatal. The statistics are brutal and unambiguous. The majority of pilots who attempt the impossible turn after engine failure shortly after takeoff do not survive. Now, why is this maneuver so dangerous from a physics and aerodynamics standpoint? The fundamental problem is energy management. When you take off, you have energy in two forms: kinetic energy, which is your airspeed, and potential energy, which is your altitude. Together, these represent your total energy state. When you lose an engine or lose all power, you're no longer adding energy to the system. You're spending the energy you have. Every second that passes, every maneuver you make, costs energy. And once your energy is depleted, once you've converted all your altitude and airspeed into the work of maneuvering and overcoming drag, you're out of options. When you turn, you're spending energy. Banking the aircraft to turn requires tilting the lift vector, so part of your lift is pointed horizontally to turn the aircraft instead of vertically to support your weight. To maintain altitude in a turn, you need to produce more total lift than in straight flight. More lift means higher angle of attack. Higher angle of attack means more induced drag. More drag means you're bleeding energy faster, converting your kinetic energy and potential energy into heat through drag. The steeper your bank angle, the more energy the turn costs. In a shallow 15-degree bank, you need only about 3% more lift, and the energy cost is manageable. In a 30-degree bank, you need about 15% more lift. In a 45-degree bank, you need 41% more lift. In a 60-degree bank, you need to double your lift production, 100% more lift, and the energy cost is enormous. Additionally, turning increases your stall speed. Stall speed increases with the square root of the load factor. In a 30-degree bank, stall speed increases by about 7%. In a 45-degree bank, by about 19%. In a 60-degree bank, by 41%. So you need more airspeed to avoid stalling while in a turn, but the turn itself is bleeding away your airspeed. These two trends converge toward disaster. If you're flying slowly to conserve energy, trying to maximize your glide range, and you enter a turn, your airspeed, which was already low, decreases further because of the turn's drag. Meanwhile, your stall speed has increased because of the bank angle. If your decreasing actual airspeed meets your increasing stall speed, you stall. And if you stall at low altitude in a turn, especially with asymmetric thrust from one failed engine, you're almost certainly going to enter a spin. At 500 or 1,000 feet, there's no altitude to recover from a spin. You're going to impact the ground, probably inverted, at high vertical speed. Unsurvivable. This is the general aerodynamic problem with the impossible turn, and it applies to all aircraft from single-engine trainers to multi-engine jets. But now let's talk about why this maneuver is particularly deadly in Citation jets, why the specific characteristics of the Citation make this already dangerous maneuver even more hazardous. The Cessna Citation 500 series, which includes the Citation 1, Citation 2, and several variants, was designed in the 1970s as an entry-level business jet. The design philosophy prioritized simplicity, ease of operation, and relatively low operating costs over maximum performance. The result is an aircraft that is reliable, proven, and adequate for its mission, but that also has some performance limitations that become critical in emergency situations. The Citation is powered by two Pratt & Whitney JT15D turbofan engines, producing approximately 2,500 pounds of thrust each at takeoff power. For normal operations with both engines running, this provides adequate performance. The aircraft climbs at around 2,000 feet per minute at typical weights. It cruises efficiently in the mid-30s altitude range. It handles well and is relatively forgiving. But the single-engine performance, particularly at high weights and low altitudes, is marginal at best. When you lose one engine on a Citation, you don't just lose half your thrust. You lose more than half your effective capability because the failed engine creates drag. A windmilling or seized engine, especially one that is catastrophically failed with damaged fan blades creating tremendous drag, acts like an air brake. Additionally, you now have asymmetric thrust creating a constant yawing moment that must be counteracted with rudder deflection, and that rudder deflection creates more drag. So instead of having 5,000 pounds of total thrust, you now have perhaps 2,500 pounds from the good engine, minus maybe 500 pounds of drag from the failed engine, minus another couple hundred pounds from rudder drag. You've gone from 5,000 pounds of effective thrust to maybe 1,700 pounds. You've lost 66% of your effective thrust capability. That's a massive performance degradation. Your climb performance on one engine is drastically reduced. Where you might have climbed at 2,000 feet per minute on two engines, you might now climb at 200 to 400 feet per minute on one engine at light weight and low altitude. At high weight, at higher altitude, or at high temperature, you might not be able to climb at all. You might actually be descending slowly, even at full power on the remaining engine. The Citation's single-engine service ceiling, the maximum altitude at which it can maintain altitude on one engine, is relatively low, around 15,000 feet or less, depending on weight and conditions. This marginal single-engine performance becomes critical when attempting the impossible turn. Because the turn requires energy, requires either airspeed or altitude to be converted into the work of turning. If you're barely climbing or not climbing at all on one engine, you don't have energy to spare for turning. Every degree of bank, every second spent turning instead of flying straight, is altitude you're losing that you might need to make it back to the runway. Let's walk through the math of what an impossible turn attempt looks like in a Citation. You're at, say, 2,000 feet when the engine fails. You want to turn 180 degrees to reverse your course back toward the airport. At 120 knots in a 30-degree bank, your turn radius is about half a mile. To complete a 180, you travel through an arc of roughly 1.5 miles. At 120 knots, that's about 45 seconds. But you're not maintaining 120 knots in the turn. The increased drag is slowing you down. Let's say you slow to 100 knots by the end of the turn, and you're not maintaining altitude either. At high weight on one engine in a 30-degree bank, a Citation will descend. Let's say you descend at 400 feet per minute. In 45 seconds, you've lost 300 feet. You're now at 1,700 feet, but you're not done. You've turned around, but you're now at least 1.5 miles from the runway threshold because you traveled away from the airport during your initial climb before turning back. You need to descend from 1,700 feet to runway elevation over a distance of 1.5 miles. That's a descent gradient of about 1,100 feet per mile, roughly a 20% gradient. Normal approach gradients are 3 degrees, about 300 feet per mile. You're trying to descend at more than 3 times the normal rate. Can a Citation make that steep approach work? Maybe, if you're light, if you use speed brakes or forward slip to increase descent rate, if visibility is good so you can see the runway clearly and judge your height accurately, if you don't encounter wind shear or turbulence, if you execute everything perfectly. Maybe you make it. But the margin for error is essentially zero. Any misjudgment of altitude or distance, any loss of airspeed that threatens a stall, any distraction or deviation, and you're not making the runway. And here's where the Citation's performance characteristics create a deadly trap. If you're trying to make that steep approach and you realize you're not going to make it, you might instinctively try to extend your glide by slowing down, by raising the nose, by increasing angle of attack to reduce descent rate. But this puts you dangerously close to stall speed, and remember, stall speed is higher in a turn. If you're still turning to line up with the runway and you slow down trying to stretch the glide, you can very easily stall. With asymmetric thrust from the failed engine, a stall is likely to be asymmetric. One wing stalls before the other. The aircraft rolls toward the stalled wing, yaws toward the failed engine, and enters a spin. At low altitude, there's no recovery. This is exactly the scenario that has killed countless pilots attempting the impossible turn. There's another Citation-specific factor that makes the impossible turn deadly, and it relates to configuration and drag management. We have evidence from the Biffle accident that the crew extended landing gear while still maneuvering back toward the airport. We have audio of Jack Dutton stating, "We're getting our gear down." The timing of this transmission suggests the gear was being extended before they were established on a stabilized final approach, probably because they felt time pressure to get configured for landing as quickly as possible. This is completely understandable from a human factors perspective. When you're low and trying to make a runway and you're not certain you're going to make it, you feel enormous pressure to get the aircraft ready to land. Get the gear down, get the flaps out, be ready, because you might only get one chance at this. But in a Citation operating on one engine, extending the landing gear early is potentially fatal. The Citation operating manual contains a specific limitation that pilots need to understand and internalize. The aircraft cannot maintain altitude with landing gear extended and flaps deployed while operating on one engine at or near maximum gross weight. This is not a suggestion. This is not a guideline. This is a hard limitation based on the aircraft's aerodynamic characteristics and available thrust. The drag from extended gear and flaps exceeds the thrust available from one engine. Physics doesn't care how badly you want to maintain altitude. If the drag exceeds the thrust, you're descending. So when the Biffle crew extended the landing gear while still maneuvering, while still trying to get lined up with a runway, They committed their energy state irreversibly. From that moment forward, they were descending at a rate determined by their drag and available thrust. The only question was whether they had sufficient altitude remaining to reach the runway before reaching the ground. They didn't. They impacted 1,800 feet short. This is the deadly combination that makes the impossible turn so dangerous in Citation specifically. Marginal single-engine climb performance means you don't have excess energy to spend on maneuvering. The temptation to configure early for landing creates massive drag that makes altitude maintenance impossible. The low altitude at which the engine typically fails means you don't have altitude reserves to absorb errors, and the degraded visibility in typical conditions means you can't accurately judge your position and height to execute the maneuver perfectly. Now let's talk about what pilots should do instead of attempting the impossible turn. The recommended procedure, taught in citation training and emphasized in safety seminars, is absolutely clear. When you lose an engine shortly after takeoff, do not turn back immediately. Instead, maintain control, maintain airspeed above minimum control speed, and continue climbing straight ahead, or with only very slight turns to avoid obstacles. Your immediate goal is altitude. Get to 3,000 feet minimum, preferably 4,000 feet or higher. At that altitude, you can engage the autopilot, which can maintain heading and altitude on one engine with no problem. With the autopilot flying the aircraft, you can focus entirely on running the engine failure checklist, shutting down the failed engine properly, reconfiguring systems, and making decisions about where to land. At altitude, you have time. Time to work the problem methodically. Time to declare an emergency with ATC and coordinate for vectors to an appropriate airport. Time to brief an approach. Time to discuss options with your crew. Time to configure at the appropriate point instead of early. And critically, time to set up a proper stabilized approach with correct speeds and descent rates. At altitude, you also have options. If you're at 4,000 feet with one engine operating, you can probably make it to several different airports. You can choose one with longer runways, better emergency services, better weather. You're not locked into returning to the small airport you departed from. You can go to a major facility with 10,000-foot runways and full crash fire rescue capability. And if the first approach doesn't work out, if you're too high or too fast or the lineup isn't good, you can go around and try again. You have fuel for multiple attempts. You're not committed to making one specific approach work or dying. That flexibility, that margin for error, is what saves lives. But executing this procedure requires overriding the most powerful instinct a pilot can experience. Because when that engine fails and you're low and the airport is right behind you, every fiber of your being screams at you to turn around. Your instinct, your emotion, your fear, all of it tells you to get back to that airport, to land now before anything else goes wrong. Resisting that instinct requires training, requires mental preparation, requires having made the decision beforehand that you will climb first, no matter what. This is why recurrent training is so critical for citation pilots. You need to practice engine failures in realistic scenarios. You need to practice continuing to climb instead of turning back. You need to make that response automatic so that when the real emergency happens and your adrenaline is flooding and your heart is pounding, you do what you've trained to do instead of what your instinct tells you to do. Training should include realistic scenarios at realistic altitudes with realistic workload and stress, not just straight and level engine cuts at cruise altitude where you have all day to work the problem, but engine failures shortly after takeoff at 2,000 feet in simulated IMC where you have to make immediate decisions under pressure. That's the training that saves lives. There's also a broader question about whether citation pilots fully understand their aircraft's single-engine performance limitations. Many citation pilots transition from other aircraft types, maybe piston twins, maybe other jets, maybe airline aircraft with very different characteristics. If you don't have extensive recent experience specifically in the citation, You might have expectations about single-engine performance that don't match reality. An airline pilot transitioning to a Citation might expect single-engine performance similar to a 737 or 757, aircraft with enormous power margins where losing one engine barely affects capability. But the Citation isn't a 737. It's a much smaller jet with much more limited single-engine performance. If your mental model is wrong, you might make decisions based on expectations that don't match what the aircraft can actually do. This may have been a factor in the Biffle accident. Dennis Dutton was an experienced airline captain with decades flying large jets. His experience was almost entirely in aircraft with performance characteristics very different from the Citation. It's entirely possible that when the engine failed, he expected single-engine performance similar to what he was accustomed to in airline jets, and made decisions based on that expectation, not realizing how limited the Citation's actual capability was. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates why the impossible turn is so deadly in Citations compared to some other aircraft. A Beechcraft King Air, a twin-engine turboprop, has significantly better single-engine climb performance than a Citation. If you lose an engine on a King Air shortly after takeoff, you can typically continue climbing at 500 to 800 feet per minute, depending on weight and conditions. That climb performance gives you options. You can turn back from relatively low altitude and still have energy to work with. But a Citation at high weight might only climb at 200 feet per minute on one engine, or might not climb at all. If you turn back, you're spending altitude you can't replenish. Every second in the turn is altitude lost. And if you then configure with gear and flaps, you're definitely descending, and the question becomes whether you have enough altitude to reach the runway. This is why the impossible turn, while risky in any aircraft, is particularly deadly in Citations. The margins are thinner, the performance reserves are smaller, the room for error is minimal. And if you compound the marginal performance with early configuration and poor visibility and time pressure, you've created a situation where survival requires perfect execution, and perfect execution under extreme stress is nearly impossible. The Greg Biffle accident should serve as a wake-up call for the Citation pilot community. This was not an incompetent crew. This was an experienced airline captain, probably one of the most qualified pilots you could have in the left seat. And despite that experience, despite professional training, despite good intentions, the decision to attempt the impossible turn proved fatal. If it can happen to an experienced crew in a properly maintained aircraft under legal weather conditions, it can happen to anyone. The only defense is understanding the danger, training for the correct response, and having the mental discipline to override instinct when the emergency occurs. For Citation pilots specifically, here are the key lessons. First, understand that your single-engine climb performance is marginal, especially at high weight. Don't assume you have excess performance to spend on maneuvering. Second, resist the temptation to turn back immediately after engine failure. Climb to altitude first. Get 3,000 to 4,000 feet before you even think about where you're going to land. Third, do not configure early. Stay clean as long as possible to maximize performance. Extend gear and flaps only when you're certain you can make the runway. Fourth, consider diverting to a larger airport with longer runways instead of attempting to return to a small field. Fifth, practice these scenarios in recurrent training so your response is automatic. The impossible turn is called impossible for a reason. It has killed hundreds of pilots over the decades. It killed Greg Biffle, Dennis Dutton, and Jack Dutton. Don't let it kill you. Make the commitment now, before the emergency, that if you lose an engine shortly after takeoff, you will climb first and turn back later if at all. That commitment might save your life. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to this channel for continued coverage of this investigation and other aviation safety topics. Share this with Citation pilots you know. The more people who understand why the impossible turn is deadly, the better chance we have of preventing the next accident. Thank you for watching, and fly safe.